Aman sir, we can start. Aman sir, just hold on for a second.
Yes, sir.
अजय आ रहा है और उधर आ रहा है आवाज?
Aman, please unmute yourself. Aman.
Yes, sir. Sir, am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible.
So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our virtual session on e-invoicing. So, as everybody would be aware, and they would have also come across this e-invoice, if not on their output, but definitely on their inward side, wherein your vendors would have actually started following this practice of generating this e-invoice and sharing tax invoice, which has this IRN, invoice registration number, already, which is printed on the same. So now, today we have gathered here to discuss the latest amendment which has come in on 1st August 2022, wherein the government has said that e-invoice provisions which were applicable for entities having turnover greater than 20 crores with effect from 1st April 2022, that limit has now been reduced to 10 crores with effect from 1st of October 2022. So basically, how does this impact? What will be the process change? What is it that while generating an e-invoice, what are the things that have to be taken care of? How the process will change? We shall be discussing all of that today. So without much ado, I would like to start by highlighting the importance of e-invoice, why e-invoice has been brought in by the government. So as you would understand that everybody in India would have their own systems, would have their own accounting software, own invoicing format, own invoicing process that they must be following. It was difficult for the government to map everything, track everything, or develop something wherein all these data could be understood by the software of the government. So what they did was they brought in this concept of e-invoice, wherein everything has to be uploaded on the invoice registration portal, IRP. That is these terms which we will be using very frequently in this session. So I'm clearing these as in when we go. So invoice registration portal. On this e-invoice portal, in a standard format, we will upload these details and generate an e-invoice, so that now what is going to happen is now government has all the data in a standard format, which can now be processed or data mined or understood by the systems of the government. So that helps the government to track all the details. Secondly, this will ensure that reconciliation happen very quickly. How? We'll look into it one by one. It will also ensure that there is a reduction in tax evasion, there is better tracking. Also, what will going to happen is your process to file your other compliances, that is also going to reduce. So if there is some additional burden that is going to come up, there are also some other benefits that will also come in because of e-invoice processes. And the last and probably the most important thing is also that e-invoice provisions will ensure that the backdated transactions that happen, those will drastically cut down. And how all of this is going to be impacted, we'll see in a very few minutes. So before we actually deep dive into anything specific, I would first like to start with the genesis. Where is the law? What provisions are triggered which relate to invoicing? So the first one is basically Rule 48 of the CGST rules, which deals with manner of issuing an invoice. So here what the government is saying is certain specific class of registered person, which will be notified by the government, they will have to generate invoice in a particular format of INV01, GST INV01, after obtaining invoice reference number, IRN number, by uploading information on the separate portal that they have established for this, and it will be subject to such conditions and restrictions as may be specified. What also they specify is that every invoice which is issued by a person to whom e-invoice is applicable, if those taxpayers do not follow the provisions of e-invoice, then whatever other invoice that they are issuing, those will not be treated as a valid tax invoice. So very important to understand that there is no other option but to comply with the provisions of e-invoice. And lastly, what they also say is that wherever e-invoice is generated, there are certain exemptions and leeways that are provided, which we will discuss as we come towards the second half of the session. So, how is e-invoicing being implemented? As I started my session by saying that a lot of our clients would have, those who have actually not started generating e-invoices, they would have actually started receiving e-invoices which bear the IRN number, invoice registration IRN number, on the invoice with a QR code. So why is it that it is now started for 10 crores and above? And the reason is because the government had decided to implement this in a phase-wise manner. So initially the plan was that entities having turnover greater than 500 crores, they would be made so the provisions of e-invoice would be made applicable to them. The initial plan was to ensure that from 1st April 2020, the plan that this would be implemented. However, because of the COVID pandemic, this date got shifted by 6 months, and thereafter it has been very constantly, they have introduced new taxpayers as and when the earlier taxpayers started getting used to it. So if you see, once the taxpayers of having turnover greater than 500 crores, they got used to it for 3 months, then they introduced new set of taxpayers by reducing the limit from 500 to 100 crores from 1st April 21. Then they did it for 50 crores, then 20 crores, and now it is, so any taxpayer having turnover of 10 crore or more in any of the previous financial year under GST, so any of the 5 years starting from July 2017, if in any year your turnover has crossed 10 crore rupees, then in that case e-invoice provisions become applicable to you with effect from 1st October 2022. Here, before we actually further go into further details, one thing I would again like to clarify that there are two types of e-invoicing provisions. The first one is specifically for B2B and B2G, business to business and business to government entities, and the other one is for B2C e-invoicing. So B2B and B2G is specifically which is going to be covered today, because B2C e-invoicing is currently applicable only for entities having turnover greater than 500 crores. So what B2C is involved, I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but just to clarify and make it very clear that this 10 crore and above limit is for B2B, B2G invoices. So whatever we will be discussing today will be applicable for tax invoices that are issued to another registered person who could either be a business entity or he could be a government entity who also have a GSTIN number. Okay, so moving forward, what is the difference between these B2B and B2C e-invoicing? So first, basically B2B e-invoicing When you generate an e-invoice, you get an IRN number, invoice registration number, and a QR code. That QR code has all the details of the invoice. So your invoice would have this IRN number and this QR code. Subsequently, your compliance, reconciliation, these are the areas that are being targeted, so that once you start applying the provisions of e-invoice, you will start becoming compliant with respect to invoicing, and your reconciliation with the data will happen also quicker. Now, the same thing with respect to B2C e-invoicing. It is basically a QR code, which is a dynamic QR code, which majorly covers payment details when you are issuing invoice to B2C customers. However, right now, let me again clarify that we are not covering B2C e-invoicing provisions, because they are applicable only for entities having 500 crores turnover above. So that the intention in B2C is to facilitate online payment, and that QR code has the payment links which has to be generated by the taxpayer themselves and print on the B2C invoices. On the contrary, for B2B invoicing, the government has set up a portal, and you have to generate this IRN and QR code for B2B invoice from the government portal. I hope the distinction is clear now. So moving forward, as I have been discussing this IRP, IRN. So now the government websites which we will be dealing with is the original one which we use for our returns, which is basically your GST returns website. The second one is for the e-way bill websites, and the third one which is now introduced is the e-invoice website. So here I have highlighted the three important links basically. So einvoice1.gst.gov.in is the website. First, here you will be required to enable your GSTIN for e-invoice provisions. Subsequently, you will then have to create a login ID and password for your each GSTIN to which e-invoice provisions are applicable. So henceforward, you will have multiple login credentials. The first one is the original one, which was the GST login ID password, which you use for returns, GST returns. The second one, wherever applicable, you would have been generating e-way bills. And now this third one for e-invoice, again a separate portal for e-invoice, which is introduced. Right now, they have introduced einvoice1.gst.gov.in. The government plans to further increase these websites so that there is less system lag. There is always a backup. There is another website which will also be handling all of it parallelly. As of now, only einvoice1.gst.gov.in has been enabled. So right now, that is the website where we have to register ourselves for generation of e-invoice. I hope I'm clear right now. Whatever the queries are, you all can either put it in the chat box right now, or by the end of the session, we'll be again taking it up. Okay, so what is the general process of generation of an e-invoice? So first, once basically as your current business practices happen, contracts are entered, services are rendered, goods are supplied. Once that happens, you generate an invoice from your system or Excel or whatever the process that is being followed currently. Once you have captured the details for generation of invoice in your accounting software or Excel, you need to pause, because now these details will have to be sent in a separate JSON format to the e-invoice portal. Now this JSON format will be uploaded on that e-invoice portal. In return, the government will give you a signed JSON e-invoice details, which will have the IRN and the QR code within that signed JSON. And using that signed JSON, you will be expected to generate a PDF, or your software will have this provision of uploading the signed JSON. And once that has been incorporated, your invoice, that is the final tax invoice, would be generated, which will not just have the regular details which you have currently, but it will additionally have these two details of IRN and the QR code, which we just generated. So first, normal process, take a pause, you generate the requisite, you capture the requisite data in a specific format, in a JSON format, upload that on the portal, retrieve the QR code and the IRN, incorporate those in your normal tax invoice, and then you can generate the final tax invoice. That is how the manual process is. So maybe those who have 2, 3, 4, 5 invoices a month, they can probably think of this approach. For others who have large number of tax invoices issued to B2B customers regularly, for them probably manual process will not be advisable. What they can do is probably their ERP or invoicing software, you punch in the details for your generation of invoice, whatever their details are, your name, customer details, service or goods details, rate, quantity details, amount. Before actually saving the invoice, there is a option there. So basically your invoice, your software will give you an option which will say, do you want to generate an e-invoice for this tax invoice? If you select yes, what the system does is, at the backend itself, it will capture the relevant details required for generation of e-invoice. It will send it to the e-invoice portal. It will fetch you back the IRN and the QR code from the e-invoice portal, and it will automatically integrate it with the invoice that you have been generating. And even before you know it, this process hardly takes 5 to 10 seconds. This entire process would be completed at the back end, and you will actually have a e-invoice in the system itself, because your invoicing software was connected at the back end with the e-invoice portal. So just to distinguish between both the processes, the first one, in the manual process, you do all the work manually. In the second case, the system does it at the back end, wherein for you, you will have your computer screens only, and all the details which are required to be captured, right from generating the JSON to obtaining the IRN and QR code, that will be done at the back end by the software itself. And once you give the command for print, your tax invoice will have the QR code and the IRN, invoice registration number, which is already printed on the tax invoice. So up till now, whatever we've discussed, I would just like to summarize what type of transactions and what is the applicability that we have been discussing. So as we first discussed, your B2B invoices, yes, for those invoices you will be required to generate IRN and QR code. Even the branch transfer invoices will require IRN and QR code. Your debit notes and credit notes, which are issued to a registered person, who are registered under GST, for those also IRN and QR code is mandatory. Export invoices, whether you are issuing to an SEZ unit or you are issuing this invoice to a foreign customer, even in those cases you are required to generate IRN and QR code. B2G, business to government. So if you are dealing with any government entity who is registered under GST, or they have a GST TDS number, GST TDS deduction number, in those cases also you are required to generate IRN and QR code. One exception is the first one that we are discussing is B2C. For B2C, IRN and QR code is not required, but as we discussed earlier, you require dynamic QR code. But currently that is applicable only for entities having turnover greater than 500 crores, nobody else. The next is bill of supply, basically the exempt supply. Since there is no tax involved, these transactions are currently kept out of the e-invoice applicability provisions. The next one is the outward RCM. So for example, if you are a security service provider, your invoice that you issue to your customer, that invoice you do not pay tax under forward charge, but your customer is expected to pay tax under reverse charge. So in those cases, if the security service provider is registered under GST, then for these invoices which he issues to the customer, on which customer is expected to pay tax under reverse charge mechanism, even those invoices have to be uploaded, and IRN and QR code will be required to be generated. The last case, so the invoices on which you as a recipient pay tax under RCM, for those self invoices you are not required to generate IRN and QR code. I hope this clears the picture further. So what are the mandatory requirements which are listed, which are required to generate the e-invoice? So the first one is invoice type, whether it is B2B, regular, credit note, debit note, what is the type? Invoice number, the current practice of which we are following, unique 16-digit number for 1 year, containing alphabets, numericals only, slash and dash only. Invoice date, supplier's legal name, GSTIN, address, state, supplier's PIN code. Very critical, PIN code is a must. Buyer's legal name, buyer's GSTIN, buyer's place of supply, buyer's address, buyer's PIN code. And in case of goods, you will also require additional details for dispatch from details, ship to details. Then all the details regarding your service or goods, description, quantity, rate, HSN, the base value, the tax rate, and the GST amount. So all of these details are mandatory. So if your system does not capture any of these currently, make sure that your systems are geared up, your ledgers are sanitized, so that you ensure that all of these details are correctly captured. If in cases where you find that buyer's PIN code, your PIN code has not been captured in your data, ensure that your systems are ready by 1st October, wherein buyer's PIN code, buyer state, all these details are correctly captured in the address details, address fields, or the fields which are provided in the accounting software itself or the billing software. So once you have generated the IRN, how does the IRN look? So basically IRN is generated using 4 parameters: supplier's GSTIN, financial year, document type, invoice, credit note, debit note, and the document number. So these 4 details will any which ways be a unique number. So when all these 4 parameters are fed in a computer using a computer algorithm, a 64-digit alphanumeric number is generated, which is unique to these 4 parameters only. So, and this is basically your IRN. This is how the IRN looks, which is basically a combination of GSTIN, financial year, document type, and document number. So if any of the parameter is changed, your IRN will look very different from the one which was generated earlier. So basically this is a computer readable detail only, nothing much you can do or verify here, just for information as to why these 4 parameters are very critical. Because as we've discussed, financial year, as it changes, for a single financial year you cannot have the same invoice number, document number which is repeating, which is already provided in the GST law. So how is the process going to now flow once you have started to implement the e-invoice provisions? The yellow arrow is the existing process wherein whatever invoice you recorded would flow to your customer, and subsequently when you file the returns on the 11th of the next month, he would come to know the details what you have uploaded and whether it matches with the invoice or no. However, moving forward, what is going to happen is, first you will generate your invoice. You will now click on that button which will be provided in your system for generation of e-invoice. So at the back end, the software will capture the details. It will push it to the invoice registration portal. It will bring back the signed JSON, which will contain your IRN and the QR code. That will be incorporated in your ERP software in your invoice, and then you will print the invoice. But when these details are being pushed to the e-invoice portal, what the government is also doing is that it is simultaneously sending these details to customers GSTR 2A. It is also sending this invoice related details on your GST portal in your GSTR 1, and it also pushes these details on the e-way bill portal. So if you want to use the details of this tax invoice, they can be accessed on your e-way bill portal directly because of backend link by the government. These details are automatically transported to GSTR1 as well, and simultaneously it is updated in customers GSTR2A also. So before you have actually sent the physical copy of the invoice to the customer, they can actually see the details what you have already uploaded in the portal. So that is the big change that is going to happen. So here, when you actually begin discussions with regard to how you want to implement the e-invoice, you need to understand that whatever software or whatever the accounting software or the invoicing software is going to help you with this e-invoice, you need to discuss regarding data security, data transition, and how integrated the approach will be, whether your data is going to move in a secured manner to the invoice registration portal and come back in a secured manner. So this is going to be an important factor that you will have to discuss. Next, on the invoice registration portal, once the data is pushed, ideally we would suggest that you do not opt for cancellation, but if you need to, the cancellation window is only 24 hours. So if 24 hours have passed and then you realize that something was wrong in the invoice, you will not be able to cancel the e-invoice. Amendments are also not allowed once the e-invoice has been generated. On the e-invoice portal, the government has said that they will not hold the data. The data will be available only for 2 to 3 days, and after that the data will be purged on the e-invoice registration portal. And as we discussed, all of these details will be pushed automatically on the GSTR1. So on probably say if from 1st October you are covered by these e-invoice provisions, so when you log into your GST portal on 5th of November, you will see whatever details that you have uploaded using this e-invoice provision, they will be readily available in the GSTR1 in the B2B section, debit note section, credit note sections. So this is how the process will now change from the existing one which we are aware about. So now that the process is changed, what is going to be the impact? your customer will come to know about these details much before, because there will be the details will flow to them and they will be independently able to view it in their GST or 2A. Even basically what they can do is, once they have the e-invoice with them, they can actually scan the QR code which will be there on the invoice, and once they scan that invoice, they can actually verify what details you have uploaded and match it with the physical copy of the invoice, so that they will be assured that whatever details have been pushed is actually received in the tax invoice. Real-time finalization of records, as we discussed. Once e-invoice is generated, there is no option to cancel, and generating a backdated invoice will entail a lot of unwanted attentions. Additional reconciliation may be required, which could include your first, what is the details which are captured in your accounting software, invoicing software. What are the turnover as per your financials, comparing that with what is there in your GST IN, what is there on the e-invoice, and probably with e-way bill in case of goods. So all of these details have to match, so that you have to ensure that the same detail is there in your system, accounts, GST returns, and the e-invoice portal. What we would suggest is that cancellation should be avoided. Instead, you should prefer for debit notes or credit notes in case you need to amend or there is some changes in the invoice. Last and probably a very important thing, once you are covered by the provisions of e-invoice, IRN is the additional detail that is going to be captured. All the existing things, including your series number, invoice series number, that continues as it is. There is no change in any of the other requirements of the invoice. So, as we discussed, that you are mandatorily expected to comply with the provisions. What if you don't comply? What if you fail to generate e-invoices from 1st of October 2022? So, as we first discussed, invoices issued will not be treated as a valid tax invoice. So you can just imagine, if the invoice that you have issued is not a tax invoice, in your hands also it is going to be an issue, in your customer's hands also it might create an issue. Secondly, the penalty that they are saying for incorrect invoicing. So basically you are covered by e-invoice provisions, yet you are not complying with e-invoice provisions, and whatever invoices that you have generated, those are incorrect. So that could entail a fine of 25,000 per instance. And also, if you transport goods without e-invoice, it may lead to detention of your goods and vehicles by the officer who would be patrolling. So all of these are the impacts considering the supplier side. What about the recipient? So one school of thought says that since the invoice issued by the supplier is not an e-invoice, is not a tax invoice, sorry, it is not a valid tax invoice, hence the ITC on that e-invoice may also not be eligible. So it could be a double whammy. You would pay taxes, but as a recipient, you are not eligible to claim that credit. So we need to at least ensure that as a recipient, what we can do is we can take a declaration from the suppliers regarding this e-invoice compliances, that right now they might not be covered, but whenever they are going to be covered, they will start complying with the e-invoice provisions. Additionally, I would also like to highlight that with effect from 18th July 2022, the government updated the tax invoice rules, wherein those taxpayers whose turnover exceeds the threshold limit, and yet they are not required to generate e-invoice because of certain exemptions. They are expected to declare a note in their tax invoice which clearly says that even though their turnover is greater than the threshold limit, they are not required to generate an e-invoice. So if you receive such a note in the tax invoices issued by certain taxpayers, then you now understand as to they are specifically exempted from e-invoices. But for other suppliers or your vendors, we would request you to obtain a declaration from them so that you as a recipient do not suffer wherein your ITC is questioned for eligibility. I hope the non-consequences are clear. Moving forward, how are we going to go about it? So the first thing that we need to see is whether we are going to opt for manual process or the ASP, GSP, basically your systems will do it at the back end. What is more suitable to your style of organization, considering the number of invoices, considering the cost involved, whether your IT software and the business processes would be linked, how they would be linked. So manner of IRN generations, whether batch process or real time. So basically, if your system itself is going to be geared up to deal with IRN, then there are two options wherein first option would be a batch process wherein say at the end of the day, all the invoices which are generated, they will be pushed together at the day end and the IRN would be generated. Or second option is generating at the real time basis as to individually one invoice which is generated, IRN is also simultaneously generated and the process is completed in each for each individual invoices. Batch process, though it will and have a benefit or a positive side that you don't need to generate e-invoice regularly, but it could also happen that some invoices are left out or all invoices did not get processed. So it was always recommended that you opt for the real-time basis wherein each individual invoice as and when they are generated, the e-invoice is also generated at the same time. Now with respect to finance and accounts, as I discussed, your GSTR1 will be auto-populated. So details regarding your B2B tax invoice that you issue, credit notes, debit notes, export details, export credit notes, all of these details get auto-populated. The other details like B2C, your HSN, your document series, those are the smaller things which you will be only henceforward required to update in your GSTR1 return, and rest you will automatically find that you can file it readily. The other thing that we discussed is vendor due diligence and account sanitization. Vendor due diligence would include asking for declarations wherever the vendor is not complying with e-invoice provisions, and account sanitization, as we discussed, you will be expected to ensure that your masters have the requisite details which are required for generation of e-invoice. And last, as far as business and operations are concerned, so see, as of today, today is 5th August. If I want to generate an e-invoice for 31st of July, the system allows me to do it. But if you see from the officer's perspective or the government's perspective, these are the type of the transactions which will be immediately highlighted to them. Moving further ahead, 2 years down the line, they might come back as to asking you as to why there was so much delay in generation of e-invoice. Hence, 1 or 2 days is explainable, but more than that, we would recommend that backdated invoices and generation of IRN for such invoices should be stopped. And lastly, whether if you have multiple branches in the state or multiple branches across India, whether you want to have this e-invoice process centralized or decentralized, that is one decision also that you will be required to take. I hope up till now we are clear. So before taking the queries from our participants, what I thought was, let me run through a few of the FAQs which are issued by the government themselves. which might clear certain doubts, certain questions that you might have regarding the e-invoice provisions. So what I've done is I've handpicked a few 15-20 FAQs, which will further clarify whatever we have discussed up till now. So the first question is whether e-invoice is applicable for supplies to the government departments. As we discussed, B2B and B2G are the transactions which are covered by e-invoice. So if a government department does not have any registration under GST, then you are not required to generate e-invoice for them. However, if they have a GSTIN or if they have a GST TDS number, then that has to be mentioned on the invoice and e-invoice will be required to be generated. Next, for high C sales, bonded warehouse sales, whether e-invoice is applicable. So again, the answer is no. These activities or transactions are neither supply of goods nor supply of services. Hence, no e-invoice is required for such cases. Whether e-invoice is required for import transactions. So as we have been discussing, e-invoice is only for outward side. Hence, the government has clarified that e-invoice will not be applicable for import bill of entry transactions. Next, which entities or sectors are exempted from e-invoice? So all your special economic zone unit taxpayers, they are exempted from generation of e-invoice. Insurers, banking companies, financial institutions and non-banking financial institutions, goods transport agency, suppliers of transport passenger service, basically your airlines, railways, they are not required to generate e-invoice. Suppliers of service by way of admission to exhibition of cinematograph films in multiplex scenes, basically means your multiplexes, your cinema theaters, they are not required to generate e-invoice. And lastly, what they have said is OIDAR, persons who are registered under Rule 14 with regard, basically who are dealing with online information data retrieval services. So for these entities, e-invoice is exempted. The provisions of e-invoices is exempt. So they will continue issuing tax invoice, but those invoices might not contain the QR code and the IRN, as we have been discussing up till now. Next, our entity, so this was the question, our entity's aggregate turnover crossed the threshold limit during the current financial year, that is example during 22-23, from which date you are expected to generate e-invoice. So say for example, till now in the past 5 years your turnover was always between 5 crores and 10 crores. Till now it has not crossed 10 crore limit. Say in November or December, the first time you cross the threshold limit of 10 crores, then e-invoice will be applicable from 1st April 23, the next financial year. It will not be applicable for the financial year in which the threshold is crossed. So next question, will IRP, the invoice registration portal, einvoice1.gov, whether they will store the e-invoice? So the government has clarified that no, they will not store any details. So even what we have experienced it, the data is only available for a period of 2 days. So say today is 5th. So right now I may be able to access only the e-invoices of 4th and 5th, which are pushed on the invoice registration portal. So whatever details that you generate, make sure you store them at your end. So because these details will not be available on the e-invoice portal after 2 days of generation of the IRN. The next question, for generating IRN, whether GSTIN of supplier and recipient should be active. But obvious, yes. So the registered person, including yourself and your customer, both your GSTIN should be active on the date on which you are raising the invoice and you are generating this IRN. Only then this e-invoice will be generated. The next one, on reporting invoice details, what will be returned by the e-invoice registration portal? Will it be only a signed JSON or PDF or both? So what the government has clarified is that the invoice registration portal will only return a signed JSON. PDF will not be returned. The systems will have to be geared up to convert this signed JSON into a PDF. Also this invoice registration portal, when you log in there, you will see that they have actually given an option, but that is optional, optional facility to generate PDF on their system itself. But what is actually going to be returned to you is only a signed JSON, and this signed JSON can then be converted into PDF on the invoice registration portal by a separate process. So next question, if e-invoice is applicable and issued, whether you are supposed to issue invoice in triplicate and duplicate. So here what the government has clarified is that once e-invoice is applicable and you have generated a valid e-invoice, then you are not expected to have duplicate and triplicate copies. That single copy can be shared and used as the case may be. With the introduction of e-invoicing, whether e-way bill is required or no? So the answer is again yes. E-way bill is a separate process. E-invoice is a separate process. Both of them will continue independently. So while transporting of goods, wherever required, e-way bill still is required to be generated, and that process does not change at all. The next question, can I amend details of a reported invoice for which IRN has already been generated? So the question is quite clear, whether you can amend the details of the invoice after IRN has been generated. So the government says that amendments are not possible. Any changes in the invoice would be, so basically if there is a change such as change in GST IN number, for this one single case, probably you can amend the details which are auto populated on the system, on the GST portal. However, if your values are changing or the place of supply has changed, in all of those cases, what we will recommend is that you issue a credit note for the earlier case, generate a fresh invoice, and not opt for this amendment process, rather than opt for the route of credit notes and debit notes, so that there is a complete trail of the transaction. The FAQ also highlights that if you have amended the details which has been auto populated on the GST portal based on the e-invoice details, these changes will be flagged to the proper officer for information. So if you do any amendment to the automatically details which have flown to the GST returns, all these changes will be flagged to the proper officer. Next question, can an IRN invoice be reported to the IRPB cancelled? As we've discussed, cancellation is allowed only up to 24 hours. After that, cancellation is not applicable. Once e-invoice is generated and subsequently you cancel the e-invoice, the report that is generated, that will have the details of this invoice, but against that invoice, the status will be mentioned as cancelled. That has been again clarified by the FAQ. Can an invoice number of a cancelled IRN be used again? So the again answer is clearly no. As we discussed and as we saw that there are 4 unique parameters, so you cannot use the same invoice number even though you have cancelled the IRN, because IRN is a unique string which is based on supplier's GST IN, document number, document type, and the financial year. So once you have generated a IRN using a specific invoice number, however, subsequently if you cancel the IRN, that invoice number is also cancelled. The next question, can you partially cancel a invoice? So answer again is clearly no. There is no partial cancellation permitted. cancellation is entirely, or you don't cancel and opt for the credit note or the debit note route. So with that, we conclude the FAQs as well. Before I end, I thought that it would be helpful for our uh, to for everybody who has joined, that I do a small demo as to how this entire process will work, provided you are opting for the manual route. When you use it the system route, it will be a very simple process. Using a single click of the button, your IRN will be generated and all the details will be captured by the system itself. But in case if you opt for a manual approach, or say you forgot to generate, and in an emergency case you are expected to generate a single invoice IRN, then how that is supposed to be done. So I will take you to the e-invoice website first. I hope my screen has changed and you are now able to see the e-invoice 1 GST website. Here, if you see on this registration portal, e-invoice enablement option is there. Once you mention your GSTIN, it will generate an OTP, and then it will enable your GSTIN for that, for the e-invoice provisions. Once your GSTIN is enabled, you will then be expected to generate your user ID and password. So using this e-invoice registration form, you can do that. Subsequently, they have provided certain Excel files, utilities, using which you can generate your IRN as well. So in this downloads, in this tool section, bulk generation tool is there. Once we go on this option, you will have these 4 formats available on the left side: format A, format B, format C, format D. Basically, all of them, you can opt for any one of them depending on what is the type of the data that you capture in your invoices. Format A is quite simple, it does not have payment details. In subsequent form C and form D, you can also capture payment and reference details if you want to. So that is one option. And there is also the other option of, if you see on the left side, GEPP version, GST invoice preparation and printing tool. You can use this tool as well. So what I've done for today is that I have downloaded this format A for your reference, and I will just run through the format, and then how the process is supposed to be done, I will explain. So now moving ahead, this is the format A which is provided. If you see on the first page, as a seller, you are expected to mention your own details, your own profile, reverse charge, GSTIN, bill from dispatch from details. So depending on what options you select, the additional fields will be enabled in this Excel file for format A. Once you have done that, on this e-invoice next slide, you will have this option: what is the supply type, B2B, SEZ, XEZ, without payment, with payment, exports with payment, without payment, whether reverse charge, yes or no, e-invoice, e-commerce, GSTIN, document type, tax invoice, credit note, debit note, document number, document date, buyer GSTIN, buyer name, trade name, POS. These are all the details, mandatory details, which we discussed also. Once you enter all of these details, you need to click on this option for validate. Once you validate it, it will give you a indicator that yes, all the details which are mandatory have been captured. After that, after you validate, this option for prepare JSON will be enabled, sorry. Once you click on that, a JSON file will be generated and saved simultaneously at the same location where this file is currently. Once that is done, this JSON you will be required to upload on the e-invoice portal after you log in. Once you do that, the system will in return give you back a signed JSON, and you can use that signed JSON to generate a PDF which will be available on the IRN portal itself. So if you see here, they have explained what is the different formats and what are the entries, what are the basic difference between format A, format B, format C, and format D. So format A is a single worksheet, format B has two worksheets. So here they say if you have multiple line items in your single invoice, then you opt for format B. If you have just a single line item regarding your product or your service, then you can use format A. Format C has 5 worksheets. Each worksheet will capture additional details. It will also capture your payment details, references, additional details. And lastly, the format D is a single worksheet, but which will have all the possible things in a single worksheet. I hope I was able to clear all the doubts possible. Also help you understand the process, non-compliances, why it is critical to ensure that e-invoice is followed. Also, it is very critical that from 1st October 2022, you need to ensure that all your invoices up to 30th September have been generated, and moving forward, all the invoices that you generate on 1st October onwards, those have to be e-invoice compliant. Also, how the process will be, what are the steps that you are required to take, whether you need to initiate a dialogue with us or with your IT teams, you need to discuss. So one simple example which I can give all of us is that of the Tally. Tally has introduced a new version, Tally Prime, which is specifically enabled for e-invoices. So if you have Tally Prime, that automatically takes care of generation of e-invoice at the backend, because Tally themselves have an integration with the e-invoice portal, and they do the generation of e-invoice backend without you actually having to do anything except for just clicking the option whether you want to generate e-invoice, yes or no. So if that is the approach, then you need to ensure that you initiate the dialogues as early as possible. And lastly, it is also very important that you are ready before time. You can the systems have been opened. So basically there is a trial website also for generation of e-invoice. You can actually try out your hand as well on those demo versions also, so that you are well aware of the process, and when the day comes, you are not stuck with anything, or your invoicing does not stop the moment e-invoice provisions kick in for you. With that, I would end the session. Also, I would also open the floor in case if there are any queries, you can put it in the chat box, and I'll take them up. So already the first question has come in. The head office turnover is greater than 10 crores, but branch office turnover is less than 10 crores, which is in another state. Will e-invoice be applicable to branch office? So to clarify, I would again specify that e-invoice applicability is not state-wise, it is pan-wise. So basically, if your turnover of the entire company crosses the threshold of 10 crores, then even if the branch has a turnover of 5 lakh, 10 lakh rupees, they are expected to comply with e-invoice provisions, because the turnover of the entire entity has crossed 10 lakh. The turnover, the threshold limit of 10 crore has to be seen vis-a-vis the entity and not state-wise registration. It will not happen wherein you are expected to generate e-invoice for certain invoices which are generated from a X state but not generating from a Y state. Hence the threshold of 10 crore has to be seen vis-a-vis the entity as a whole. Yes. Any other questions? I think we are done. Hopefully, the messages and the details have been understood well. If there are any queries, you can obviously connect with us at any time. You can drop in a mail to us. We would be more than happy to help. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Have a great weekend. Thank you.